can't ever remember singing that hymn, interestingly. It's a hymn, a prayer really, for our children. Let them thy blessings share, grace on earth and bliss in heaven. And may their hearts be drawn to thee, and in their earliest infancy, and cleanse their souls from every stain. It's the longing of our hearts to see our children converted, isn't it? And not to fall short of that. It's what disturbs me about some of these doctrines that come up that allow people somehow into a situation of confidence, self-confidence, that they have arrived when they haven't. Concerns me that our children don't fall short of that. It becomes very close to home when it's our children that are involved. So we come to this passage in 1 Samuel chapter 18. Although I'm taking the section from verse 9 onwards, I'd just like to refer you back to verse 5. So 2 Samuel chapter 18, verse 5. And the king commanded Joab and Abishai and Ittai, saying, deal gently for my sake with the young man, even with Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave all the captains charge concerning Absalom. So deal gently for my sake with the young man, even with Absalom. Well, let me ask a question. Would Absalom have dealt gently? I'm already getting the answer, aren't I? He would not, would he? He was out not only for the destruction of David's army, but to destroy David as well. He wanted him dead. He would have rendered no such compassion at all. So if you just want to confirm that, you look back at chapter 17, verses 12 and 13, where we have the advice that Hushai, David's friend, is giving to Absalom. And he says, we shall come upon him in some place where he shall be found, and we will light upon him as the dew falleth upon the ground. And of him and all the men that are with him, there shall not be left so much as one. It was total destruction. Moreover, he said, as if he's layering now on top of that, he said, if he be gotten into a city, remember he was in Mahanaim at the time, then, he said, shall all Israel bring ropes to that city, and we will draw it into the river. It's very pictorial language, isn't it? But you get the point. We're going to tear this city apart until there be not one small stone found upon another, or found there. And Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than that of Ahithophel. So this is really what they wanted to do. It was complete destruction. Remember, they were seeking to destroy David, his army, but that would have included his family. It was all involved in that passage there that we've just gone back to. So David instructs his, or advises, or however you want to put it, his generals and his captains concerning Absalom. Just think about it for a minute though. In verse 5 in chapter 18, David's quite confident in a way, confident that they're going to have this opportunity. So he says, look, treat Absalom for my sake gently. He's confident that they're going to have this happen to them. Why is he so confident? Was he not overconfident that this was going to be an opportunity, expecting Absalom to be at the mercy of his relatively small army? Remember, I mentioned last time, Josephus, the historian, talks about this, David's forces here as numbering about 4,000. And we can make certain calculations about the whole army of Israel on Absalom's side, probably exceeding 40,000. How come David is so confident that he can say to his generals, be gentle with Absalom for my sake? What's making him so confident? That God. Correct, in general terms. It certainly is. Given that the previous chapter we've studied, we saw Ahithophel's advice being rejected. It was superb advice, but it was rejected. And Hushai's advice, David's friend, was the one that they received. Doesn't that give you the clue to why David was so confident? He's confident because he's seen the answer to his prayer. His prayer was concerning Ahithophel's advice, let it be made foolishness, brought to nothing. He then sees Ahithophel go home, kill himself, and Hushai's advice to gather the whole armies of Israel from Dan to Beersheba together. That's exactly what happened. And Absalom crossed the Jordan with an enormous army, and David knew God was answering his prayer. He'd had time to gather his forces together. He knew, therefore, that God was on his side and opposed to Absalom. So he's saying this knowing full well that this would happen. So what do we take from that? In practical terms, what do you do when your prayers are answered? You give thanks, definitely. Does it do more? You certainly give thanks, absolutely. It's the way you begin, isn't it? It's the first thing you do. Having seen the prayer answered and having given thanks, how do you take it on from there? Do you have some expectation? Right, you have confidence. I'm not saying it always does this with me, but when you get a prayer answered that is so singular in this way, such an important issue, does it not encourage you to pray for more? And so I'm thinking of William Carey's statement here. Expect great things from God. Attempt great things for God. So if your expectation is that God has answered this prayer, I'm expecting, therefore, since the answer to this prayer involves a victory in battle, I'm expecting it. And I'm going to have confidence in it. I'm going to instruct my generals to do this, because this is what he knows that this is going to happen. So I think it's when we have answers to our prayers, for instance, in our prayer meeting, over these last 12 months, 2 years, 3 years, whatever, and we're thinking, well, you know, it began in the prayer meeting. Should we let go now? When blessing comes, you don't stop, do you? If you see the little gentle shower of revival coming and souls being blessed, do you stop praying then and think, well, it's coming? Or do you, with great expectancy, start to act upon it and to gear yourself up and be ready in prayer and in other ways for the coming of that blessing? Well, you can see what I'm saying here. So David makes this personal now to his generals, and he says, look, do this for my sake. It's an emotional comment, isn't it? For my sake. His appeal opens the door into his own feelings. So, you know, I think some people, when it exposes your innermost heart dealings, doesn't it, really? And it can be seen by some people as a sign of weakness. Well, you take it how you will. But he's talking about his feelings for this young man, his son. He still looks at him as a young man, although he's grown, hasn't he? What would blind justice require of that man who is hanging by his head between heaven and earth? If justice were to approach that young man, what would it do? Is he a murderer? He is, isn't he? He killed his brother Amnon. Is he an insurrectionist, a rebel, trying to overthrow the king? He is, isn't he? He has committed incest with his father's wives, 10 of them that were left in Jerusalem. What would blind justice do? Does blind justice see Absalom and say, oh, it's all right, he's the king's son, he's royalty, we'll leave him, let him go? That's not blind justice, is it? Blind justice treats him as it would treat anyone else. He's a murderer, he's guilty of insurrection and rebellion, and on those 2 counts alone, he's worthy of death. So, justice, you might say, shouldn't spare the murderer who had raised this insurrection. What position did this put David's men in? They're hazarding their lives, aren't they? On the battlefield. Yeah, fear. That if they are put in this position, what would they do? They're being attacked by this man, physically, and with his whole army there. Surely it created a great difficulty for them. It's a difficulty that you'd never want to be put in, isn't it? Interestingly though, I don't know what it makes you think of, but my mind immediately went to, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. And yet they're the ones who are crucifying the Lord. And you're looking at it from that perspective. Now, our children may cause us a great deal of affliction. You think about your own children, I'll think about mine. And they can really, really bring us under a great affliction and grief and sorrow. How do you respond? Lord, deal gently with them. Why? Because the young man Absalom, well, he's my son, it's my daughter. After all, and I'm thinking about David now, the affliction had been sent to correct him, not Absalom. And I'm thinking, yes, perhaps when my children have put me through this affliction or that affliction, it's not for their sakes that they are being put through this, it's for mine. David's here. I think there's a massive lesson there for us. It was with David sent to correct him. It was not sent in that sense for Absalom's sake. And then we come to this verse 9. Absalom met the servants of David. And Absalom rode upon a mule, and the mule went under the thick boughs of the great oak, and his head caught hold of the oak, and he was taken up between heaven and earth, and the mule that was under him went away. So here's Matthew Henry, okay? The mule was glad to be rid of such a burden. I love Matthew Henry. It's a lovely comment, isn't it? The man hung between heaven and earth, not worthy of heaven or earth. He was abandoned by both. That's what he says. I might add something to that. He was abandoned by his army as well. They showed no loyalty to him, did they? Well, where are they? Surely he wasn't alone on the battlefield. Hushai had recommended he goes at the head of his army, and it appealed to his arrogance. Remember, he was a very handsome fellow. Imagine him on his horse with 50 men in front of him crying, Absalom the king, and so on. Absalom reigneth in Hebron, and all that. Here he is at the head of an army, and he's alone. What a sight that must have been. They showed no attachment to him, it seems, anyway. I think we can infer that fairly safely from the passage. And so we go on to verse 10. And a certain man saw it and told Joab and said, Behold, I saw Absalom hanged in an oak. So he's seen, he's witnessed in this desperate position. And the witness, although it's an unnamed witness, then what did he do? Was he right to do what he did? Because he then immediately goes to Joab and he tells him. Do you think he should have done something else? Should he have cut him down? What would you have done? This is the dilemma that David has put them in. This is their enemy hanging from here, who would kill them if he could. He hated David. What an awful thing, isn't it? When our children get to a position where hatred is in the air. Certainly the commentators talk about him probably having done the right thing to have gone up the line of command, because he knew the generals had been given this order, and his line would be, well, I'm safe going to them, I'm going to let the responsibility be theirs. Verse 11, and Joab said unto the man that told him, And behold, sawest thou him, and why didst thou not smite him there to the ground? And I would have given thee 10 shekels of silver and a girdle. Let's say that 10 shekels of silver is a fair wad of money, and the girdle is probably something relating to some kind of medal, a battle honor I would have given you for doing this. So, how did Joab regard the dilemma that this man is in, the witness who'd seen him hanging in the tree? What does Joab think of that? Did he sympathize with the man? I don't see any sympathy there. Well, you were in a dilemma there, corporal or whatever you are in the army. You're in a dilemma there. I'm glad you brought it to me. Thank you for bringing it to my attention. There's no such thing in Joab's mind at all as that. He didn't acknowledge in any way that this man obviously had scruples. He wasn't going to put Absalom to death. He'd heard the message that had come from David. It was known to him. But rather than these, Joab appears cold-blooded murder is what he was advocating. Absalom couldn't exactly fight back, could he? He's hanging there in this tree. But cold-blooded slaughter was what he'd suggested, and I'll pay you for it. Well, I can't think of a more mercenary attitude than to offer financial reward for such a thing. And the man in verse 12, the man said unto Joab, Though I should receive 1,000 shekels of silver in my hand, yet would I not put forth my hand against the king's son, for in our hearing the king charged thee and Abishai and Ittai, so the whole lot of them, saying, Beware that none touch the young man Absalom. Otherwise, I should have wrought falsehood against mine own life, for there is no matter hid from the king, and thou thyself would have set thyself against me. What do you think of this man? Any thoughts? What do you think of his attitude? What do you think of his approach? Did he stand his ground? Well, did he stick to his principles? He did. He stood up against Joab. I'll tell you, I don't know who'd want to stand up against Joab, but this man did. He stood his ground with him. He refused to be intimidated by Joab's attitude, and he continued to show respect for the king, even in opposition to what Joab was advocating. He deserves our respect. And at the end of it, he quite shrewdly answers Joab in language that's quite well suited to Joab's devious nature, shall we say. He's really saying, if I can put it in these words, what good is a reward to me? What's the point of having 10,000 or 12,000 shekels of silver if I'm going to have to forfeit my own life for doing it? And you would have taken the opportunity to oppose me should I have done it. In other words, Joab didn't give a hill of beans for this man's life. Not at all. And he would probably not have saved him if he had drawn the sword and killed Absalom. So the answer that he gave Joab was pretty unanswerable. I think it shut Joab up. And it was designed to do so. I think it's a clever answer. Answers him on his own terms, in a way. If you consider Job's character, and perhaps we could do just for a few minutes here. How long had he been following David? A long time? Right from the beginning. We've been studying the life of David. He was there from early days. He was in the wilderness when Saul began to pursue David. He was with him. And during that time, did he not share the deprivations and hardships that David had? He did. He was a zealous servant, even on the battlefield. Yes, all of that. And yet, it seems from our readings that we've already had that he sought power, and he acted often in self-interest rather than in David's interest. Can you give me any examples? From our Bible studies, who did he kill? And why? Abner. Why did he kill Abner? Do you remember what Abner had done? Yeah. So, his fleet of foot was chasing him, wasn't he? And he killed him with a spear. And he was out for revenge, was Joab. So he killed Abner. Against or with David's approval? It was against, wasn't it? So he was willing to run against the king's wishes in order to exercise his own. So the murder of Abner, well, that's one. What about the matter of Absalom? Whose side had Joab been on at first? He brought him back, didn't he? He was instrumental in bringing Absalom back from exile. And he turned David with some amount of intrigue. He managed to turn David. So how is he going to feel when Absalom now turns on David in insurrection and rebellion? What position is that going to put Joab in? He brought Absalom back, and now Absalom has turned. He's now even attacking Joab as well as David. How's that going to make Joab feel? No, it wouldn't be very good. He was clearly outraged that this had happened, I would infer. It was humiliating for him, having brought this man back, for him now to turn in this way on the king and upon him after supporting him in that way. It's not going to be long before we come to the passage, God willing, where he's going to be murdering someone else, a man called Amasa, who David made the head of the army. And in doing that, David, a few verses on from this, is replacing Joab as head of the army. So what does Joab do to Amasa? He kills him. Could David do anything about it? He's got himself into such a powerful position through intrigue and murder and all the rest of it that he's almost unassailable in these things. So you come to verse 14. Then said Joab, I may not tarry thus with thee. And he took 3 darts in his hand and thrust them through the heart of Absalom while he was yet alive in the midst of the oak tree. Got one question there. Is that out of character? Absolutely not. It's completely within his characteristics. Did it show regard for David? No. Just the reverse, really. Did he care if David was outraged at what he'd done? It would not appear so. Did he show, here's more significant now, did he show any regard to God? There's nothing there, is there? There's no mention of it. Did he care if David was so humiliated by his callous disregard for his instructions? No. He didn't care. He was unassailable, really, in his position at the head of the army. David seemed too weak to dismiss Joab, although he tried it later, and Joab simply took revenge on Amasa and killed him. And also, David is too suspicious to trust him. So he's in a difficult position. And yet, strangely, he did trust him in one thing, didn't he? And that was in the murder of Uriah, because he used Joab to do that. So David had put himself in a terrible position. Joab was clearly an able and energetic warrior who was quite happy to avenge his honor at David's expense. He didn't care for David. There was a time when David had to assert his authority over Joab, and he did so after the death of Abner. In fact, if you look back a few chapters into chapter 3 in 2 Samuel and verse 31 and 36 there, we read that David said to Joab and to all the people that were with him, and these are the ones who've murdered Abner, he says, rend your clothes and mourn before Abner. And King David himself followed the bier, and they buried Abner, and so on. You read on from those verses. And all the people took notice, and it pleased them, as whatsoever the king did pleased all of the people. Those were better days for David. But it seems after this period of illness that I've spoken about that he'd had, he was considerably weakened, and especially after the death of Uriah and so on. So in the days of his popularity, there was no rival really to David, but in these days, this is when the kingdom was really beginning to weaken. And towards the end of David's reign, it became weaker and weaker in many ways. So certainly by this stage, it would appear that Joab neither loved nor regarded David as a friend at all. Joab himself was acting like sovereign, like the king in the army, certainly, and he no longer cared for these things. So we get to verse 15. 10 young men that, 10 young men that bare Joab's armor compassed about and smote Absalom and slew him. And Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing after Israel, for Joab held back the people. So here is what we might regard as justice being done, in a sense, blind justice being done. David's crown was certainly protected in what Joab did, but we also must see that David was utterly humiliated in what happened here. His orders were not obeyed at all, and so he's plunged into grief. Why would David grieve at all this? Well, surely it's because he's the cause of it. He's actually caused his son's death. This is God's judgment of David. And Absalom's body, in verse 17, is now treated with utter contempt. They took Absalom and cast him into a great pit in the wood, and David laid a very great heap of stones upon him, and all Israel fled, every one to his tent. So he was buried as though, well, if you look back in Deuteronomy, the disobedient son who is a drunkard and all the rest of it, they were commanded to stone him and just leave him buried under a heap of stones. And that's effectually what is certainly not buried as a royal person, is he? No ceremony at all. And so when we look at verse 18, as we run through the final section here, this is quite a contrast, isn't it, with his burial. But he raised up this tower, this pillar, reared up for himself in the king's dale, for he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. And he called the pillar after his own name. Did he have any sons? Yes, he did. There were 3, weren't there? And a daughter who he named Tamar, after his sister. It's quite clear by this stage they were all dead. Otherwise, the inference is he had no sons left. They died. So, well, there's another sad judgment that came upon him. And then said Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, let me now run and bear the king tidings how that the Lord hath avenged him of his enemies. You can see in that statement a godliness about him. He's referring to the Lord immediately. He wants to be positive with the king. He's bringing him good tidings. Let me run and bear the king tidings how the Lord hath avenged him of his enemies. Clearly very devoted to David. He was the one who originally came with the message from his father in Jerusalem, didn't he, to warn David of the danger that he and his followers were in. And Ahimaaz wanted him to hear that. Instead, we've got Cushai, and that's an Ethiopian name. He's not a Jew. And he's the one that, it seems clear that he'd witnessed the death as well. He's probably one of Joab's bodyguard. He'd witnessed the death of Absalom, so he told the king and reported the facts that he had seen. And in verse 32, you hear his report. And the king said to Cushai, is the young man Absalom safe? And Cushai answered, the enemies of my lord the king, and all that rise against thee to do thee hurt, be as this young man. Any mention of God? Zero. Nothing in it. There's Joab's man for you. And David's man, Ahimaaz, wanting to put the spiritual element onto this to encourage his king. I don't know about you, but I'd much rather receive bad news from a spiritual man or woman than I would from someone like Cushai. The Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. I'd rather hear that than the statement that Cushai made. Amen.
Oh.
Yes.
Do you mind if I say something?
Please. I don't mind at all. Be glad you do.
There is actually a terrible irony in this passage. So Absalom was a man of great beauty, and his hair was his big thing, and that was his destruction. He was caught by it in the tree. and he dies a cursed man hanging in a tree. And maybe I'm stealing your thunder.
No, we did it last week.
Oh.
Really covered it. It was his pride that brought his downfall, really. And in a way, it's because he's a proud man. He's got these 50 men and horses running, in front of him, proclaiming that he is now reigning in Hebron and all that kind of thing. It reminded me, actually, of others, because Ahithophel, his great gift was running, and that's what got him killed in the end. And there are others who've fallen into a similar trap. Pride comes before a fall, and I think I don't know what he's done with his hair really, but he got himself caught in this tree. Probably, though it doesn't say so, by his hair. It's certainly.
But in a bizarre way, it describes him earlier as being. There was no blemish in him. And in a bizarre way, he is a type of Christ. He is the king's son who dies hanging in the tree. And dies cursed. And is buried as a cursed man.
The difference is that it was his own curse, not because the Lord took our curse upon him. There's the big difference. But there are a number of other men in the scriptures who Asahel, you could say, or infer at least, that his swiftness brought his death, and his speed was what he was known for, his pride, just like Absalom was known for his beauty and his hair. Or Ahithophel, if you want to talk about him, he was known for his counsel and his wisdom. And what brought his downfall? His counsel and his wisdom. He couldn't take it when he was rejected, and so he committed suicide. It's a salutary lesson, and perhaps in some senses, in a strange way, it does point to the Lord Jesus Christ taking our curse upon him. There we are now.